January 8th, 1815. The pre-dawn mist hung thick over the sugarcane fields outside New Orleans as Major General Edward Pakenham, brother-in-law to the Duke of Wellington and veteran of the Peninsula Campaign, surveyed the American defensive line through his telescope. What he saw should have filled him with confidence: a ragtag collection of earthworks manned by frontier militia, pirates, free men of colour, and regular soldiers who looked more like farmers than warriors. Pakenham commanded 8,000 British regulars, the finest infantry in the world, men who had defeated Napoleon's marshals in Spain and France. Across that misty field stood fewer than 4,500 Americans behind a mud rampart. The mathematics seemed simple: professional soldiers against amateurs, disciplined volleys against scattered fire, European military science against frontier improvisation. What General Pakenham could not see through his telescope, what no British officer that morning could have imagined, was that they were about to encounter a revolution in military technology and tactics. Behind that mud wall waited men armed with weapons their enemies had never faced in concentrated numbers, long rifles capable of killing at distances that made a mockery of smoothbore muskets. More importantly, behind those rifles were men who had learned to shoot before they learned to read, who could hit a squirrel's eye at 100 yards, who viewed marksmanship not as military drill, but as survival skill honed from childhood. The British Army was about to discover that all their experience fighting Napoleon meant nothing against an enemy that could kill you before you knew you were in range. This is the story of how American riflemen transformed warfare in a single morning, how frontier shooting skills defeated the world's most professional army, and how British officers trained in European tactics learned too late that the rules of war had changed. The long rifle that would devastate British ranks at New Orleans had evolved over 80 years in the forests and mountains of colonial America. German gunsmiths immigrating to Pennsylvania in the 1730s brought with them the Jaeger rifle, a short, heavy weapon designed for European hunting. In America, they discovered a landscape that demanded something different. The vast forests of the frontier required a weapon that could kill deer at long range to feed families, drop a bear threatening livestock, and defend against threats both animal and human. These immigrant craftsmen began modifying their designs. They lengthened the barrel, some reaching 44 inches or more, allowing powder to burn completely and imparting greater velocity. They reduced the caliber from the Jaeger's hefty .62 to a more economical 45 to 50 caliber, conserving precious lead and powder. Most critically, they cut rifling grooves inside the barrel that spun the ball, stabilizing its flight and delivering accuracy that seemed almost supernatural to those accustomed to smoothbore muskets. By the American Revolution, the Pennsylvania rifle, later called the Kentucky rifle, though few were made there, had become the defining weapon of the frontier. A competent rifleman could hit a man-sized target at 200 yards with regularity. Exceptional shooters could kill at 300 yards or more. The British Brown Bess musket, standard infantry weapon of the era, was considered accurate to perhaps 50 yards, effective in massed volleys to maybe 100. The difference wasn't just technological. It was cultural. British soldiers were trained to stand in ranks, load by memorized drill, and fire in volleys on command. Accuracy was irrelevant. Volume of fire and discipline under pressure were everything. A well-trained British regiment could fire 4 volleys per minute, creating a wall of lead that shattered enemy formations. Individual marksmanship was not merely unnecessary, it was discouraged. Soldiers who aimed were soldiers who weren't maintaining rate of fire. American frontiersmen learned to shoot differently. A boy on the frontier received his first rifle around age 10. By 15, he was expected to provide meat for the family. This required genuine marksmanship. Powder and lead were expensive. Wasting ammunition meant the family went hungry. Every shot had to count. Frontier shooting matches were social events where men competed for prizes, but more importantly for reputation. Contests involved targets Europeans would consider impossible: driving nails at 60 yards, snuffing candle flames without damaging the wick at 100 yards, cutting playing cards edge-on at 80 yards. These weren't military exercises. They were entertainment that happened to produce the most skilled marksmen on Earth. The effectiveness of American rifles had been demonstrated during the Revolution, most famously at the Battle of Saratoga, where Daniel Morgan's riflemen systematically eliminated British officers at ranges that shocked their enemies. But the rifle had limitations that prevented it from replacing the musket as standard infantry weapon. Loading was slow, requiring careful measurement of powder, precise seating of a patched ball that had to be hammered down the rifled barrel, and individual percussion cap or priming. A skilled rifleman might manage 2 shots per minute. A trained musket man could fire 4. Rifles couldn't mount bayonets effectively, leaving riflemen vulnerable to cavalry and infantry charges. In open field battles, massed musket volleys and bayonet charges still dominated. But at New Orleans, the Americans wouldn't be fighting in open fields. They would be shooting from behind fortifications at an enemy forced to advance across open ground. Every limitation of the rifle would become irrelevant. Every advantage would be magnified. Major General Andrew Jackson understood this perfectly. The 47-year-old Tennessee lawyer and militia general had spent years fighting Creek Indians in frontier warfare, where marksmanship meant survival. He knew what frontier riflemen could do because he had led them. When he arrived in New Orleans in December 1814 to organize the city's defense against an expected British invasion, Jackson immediately recognized that he couldn't defeat British regulars in conventional battle. His forces were too small, too poorly trained, too diverse. He had perhaps 700 US Army regulars, the 7th Infantry Regiment, understrength and including many recent recruits. He had Louisiana militia, shopkeepers and clerks who had barely trained. He had 2 battalions of free men of colour, whose fighting ability was unknown. He had Choctaw warriors whose loyalty to the American cause was uncertain. He had Jean Lafitte's Barratarian pirates, skilled sailors and gunners but hardly soldiers, and he had approximately 2,000 riflemen, Tennesseans and Kentuckians who had travelled hundreds of miles to defend New Orleans. These were the men Jackson counted on, not for their discipline or their ability to stand in formation, but for their ability to kill British soldiers before those soldiers could close to bayonet range. Jackson's defensive position was brilliant in its simplicity. The British would have to attack from the south, advancing across the Chalmette plantation between the Mississippi River on their right and an impassable cypress swamp on their left. The frontage was only about 1,000 yards wide. Jackson ordered the construction of a mud rampart along an old mill race called the Rodriguez Canal. The earthwork was crude, built primarily by enslaved labourers working through December nights. It stretched from river to swamp, roughly 4 feet high and 20 feet thick at the base, reinforced with cotton bales and whatever timber could be scavenged. Behind this wall, Jackson positioned his riflemen with clear fields of fire across the open plantation fields the British would have to cross. The rampart was high enough to provide cover while allowing men to rest their rifles on top for steady aim. The British would be advancing uphill, a gentle slope that seemed insignificant, but would leave them gasping for breath. Most importantly, the killing ground was nearly 800 yards deep. British soldiers would be under accurate rifle fire for the entire advance. On Christmas Eve 1814, British forces landed at Lake Bourne and began their approach to New Orleans. General Pakenham arrived on Christmas Day to take command. A distinguished officer at 37, Pakenham had served under Wellington in the Peninsula, leading the 3rd Division at Salamanca, where his attack had shattered the French left flank. Wellington himself had praised Pakenham's tactical judgment and cool courage under fire. Pakenham commanded the 4th, 21st, 44th, 85th and 93rd Regiments of Foot, units with distinguished battle honours from campaigns across Europe and the West Indies. These were not garrison troops or militia. They were professional soldiers who had faced French artillery and cavalry charges without breaking. They had stormed fortified positions in Spain. They expected to scatter the American rabble in a single assault and celebrate New Year's in the captured city. The British made their first probe on December 28th, a reconnaissance in force to test American defences. It ended in bloody repulse when American riflemen and artillery drove them back with surprising effectiveness. Pakenham was troubled but not deterred. He ordered artillery brought forward for a proper bombardment before the main assault. On January 1st, 1815, British artillery opened a bombardment intended to destroy the American rampart and drive defenders from their positions. For 2 hours, British guns fired at the earthwork. The Americans responded with their own artillery, manned largely by Lafitte's pirate gunners, who proved remarkably skilled. When the smoke cleared, the British had achieved nothing. Cannonballs buried themselves in the soft earth and cotton bales without causing significant damage. Several British guns had been disabled by accurate American counter-battery fire. Worse, British soldiers advancing behind the bombardment had been shredded by rifle fire at ranges they didn't think possible. Pakenham withdrew to reconsider. His officers assured him that artillery had softened American defences, that casualties had been inflicted, that morale must be shaken. They were wrong on every count. Behind the rampart, American casualties had been minimal. The riflemen had spent the bombardment lying low behind the earthwork, then risen to fire at exposed British infantry with devastating accuracy. And their confidence had grown. They had seen British soldiers fall at distances that amazed even experienced frontiersmen. Private David Crockett, the legendary Tennessee frontiersman fighting with the militia, later wrote of those early exchanges. "We could knock them down quicker than they could get to us. They came on brave enough, redcoats in perfect lines like they were on parade. But every time an officer showed himself, one of our boys would draw a bead and down he'd go. I saw a British captain on horseback maybe 250 yards out. Billy McGregor said watch this and fired. The captain pitched backward off his horse like someone had hit him with an axe. Billy reloaded, calm as you please, and got a sergeant before the British fell back. This wasn't war like they taught it. This was hunting, and the British were the game." Pakenham spent the next week preparing for a decisive assault. He brought up more artillery, he ordered fascines, bundles of sugarcane stalks bound together, prepared for filling the canal. He constructed scaling ladders for assaulting the rampart. He divided his force for a multi-pronged attack. His plan was tactically sound according to European military doctrine. The 93rd Highland Regiment would advance along the river edge. The 21st and 4th Regiments would advance in the centre. The 44th Regiment would lead, carrying fascines and ladders to bridge the canal and scale the rampart. Meanwhile, a detachment under Colonel Thornton would cross the river and assault the American position on the west bank, capturing artillery that could then enfilade Jackson's main line. It was the sort of coordinated assault that had worked against French fortifications in Spain. It should have worked in Louisiana. What Pakenham's plan didn't account for was that his soldiers would be advancing across open ground against men who had spent their lives learning to kill at distance. The night of January 7th passed tensely for both armies. British soldiers tried to sleep in the cold mud, knowing attack would come with dawn. They cleaned their muskets, checked their flints, sharpened bayonets. Veterans assured younger soldiers that the Americans would break at the sight of British regulars advancing with bayonets. The rebels were frontier rabble who would run when they saw real soldiers coming. Behind the rampart, American riflemen prepared differently. They cast fresh balls, ensuring perfect roundness for accuracy. They cut cloth patches of precise thickness. They measured powder charges carefully, knowing that consistency meant consistent point of aim. They cleaned their rifles obsessively, checking every moving part. Some men unpacked their best shooting coats, garments with large pockets for carrying preloaded paper cartridges that would speed reloading slightly. Many had specific rifles they'd named, weapons they'd owned for decades. These weren't military-issue firearms. They were personal tools, as individual as the men who carried them. Captain Thomas Beale, commanding a company of New Orleans Rifles, walked the line that night checking his men's positions. Years later, he recorded his observations. The Kentuckians and Tennesseans were calm, almost bored. They treated the coming battle like they were waiting for deer to come into a clearing. I saw men gambling, playing cards for small stakes. Others were sleeping, rifles cradled like children. A few were making last-minute adjustments to their positions, packing earth to create more stable shooting rests. There was no panic, no dramatic speeches. These men knew what was coming, and they knew what they could do. One old hunter from Kentucky told me he'd been shooting longer than most British soldiers had been alive. He said at 200 yards he could put 5 balls through a playing card. Tomorrow he'd be shooting at targets considerably larger. The confidence wasn't bravado. It was earned. At 5:30 a.m. on January 8th, 1815, British rockets arced into the sky, the signal for the general advance. Through the morning mist, American sentries saw the British army begin moving forward. They came in perfect formation, rank upon rank of red-coated soldiers advancing with mechanical precision. The morning was cold, temperature in the 40s, and ground fog obscured vision below chest height. British officers rode horses easily visible above the fog. Regimental colours flew proudly. Drums beat the cadence. It looked magnificent, terrifying, unstoppable. The British advanced at quick march, covering ground steadily. At 500 yards, they were barely visible through the mist. American artillery opened fire first. Grapeshot and canister rounds tore gaps in the formations. The British ranks closed up automatically, men stepping over fallen comrades without breaking stride. This was what they'd been trained to do. This was what made them the finest infantry in the world. At 400 yards, the British formations were clearly visible despite the fog. Officers' commands could be heard over the drumbeat. Jackson walked behind his line, calling out, "Stand fast and fire low. They're coming on, boys. Make every shot count." At 350 yards, the first rifle shots cracked out. Individual marksmen, mostly Tennesseans on the right of the American line, began firing at visible targets. British officers, easily identified by their positions, swords, and often their horses, began falling. A captain of the 93rd Highlanders pitched forward. A lieutenant in the 21st Regiment clutched his chest and collapsed. The British continued advancing. Officers fell, but sergeants took over without pause. This too they had trained for, but the rifle fire was intensifying. At 300 yards, more riflemen opened fire. The distinctive crack of long rifles, sharper and louder than musket fire, began to dominate the battlefield soundscape. British soldiers began falling with increasing frequency, not from massed volleys, but from precisely aimed individual shots. A sergeant would gesture forward and suddenly jerk backward, a half-inch ball through his chest. A colour-bearer would take 2 steps and crumple, killed by a shot fired from 300 yards away by a man he never saw. The British formation began to waver. This wasn't the kind of fire they had experienced in Europe. French musket volleys came in clouds of smoke, terrifying but inaccurate. You advanced through the fire knowing most balls would miss, trusting in numbers and momentum to carry you through to bayonet range. This was different. The American fire was individual, aimed, precise. Every shot seemed to find a target. There was no volley fire to pace yourself against, no rhythmic blasts you could time your advance to. Just an irregular, constant cracking of rifles and British soldiers falling. At 250 yards, the full American line opened fire. Over 2,000 rifles began speaking. Behind the earthwork, riflemen worked with calm efficiency. Fire, reload, with practiced motions that didn't require thought, aim carefully at an individual target, fire again. The better shooters were firing once per minute. Some of the best managed slightly faster. It didn't seem like rapid fire compared to massed musket volleys. But every single shot was aimed. Every single shot had a good chance of hitting a man. The British soldiers advancing across that field began to understand they were in a kind of hell their training had never prepared them for. Colonel Robert Rennie, leading the 21st Regiment, saw his company officers falling around him. His adjutant took a ball through the throat. His senior captain was shot through the chest. A lieutenant had his jaw blown away by a round that should have been impossible at that range. Rennie had fought in Spain, at Vittoria and Toulouse. He had advanced under French artillery. But this was worse. The French fired volleys, terrifying sheets of flame and smoke, but most balls flew wild. You could advance through French fire expecting casualties but knowing you'd get through. This American fire was surgical. Every crack of a rifle meant someone fell. His men were beginning to panic, their parade ground precision dissolving as soldiers instinctively sought cover where none existed. At 200 yards, British soldiers began to falter. The advance slowed as men unconsciously sought to present smaller targets, to crouch, to hide behind the men in front of them. Officers and sergeants screamed orders to maintain formation, to press forward. Many of those officers and sergeants died mid-command, shot by riflemen who deliberately targeted leaders. The 44th Regiment, carrying fascines and ladders needed to cross the canal, had fallen into chaos. Their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Mullins, had forgotten to position his regiment properly at dawn. In the confusion, the 44th advanced without most of their equipment. When they realized the error, the regiment halted, milled in confusion, and became a perfect target for American riflemen. Private John McClung from Tennessee, positioned near the center of Jackson's line, later described what he saw. They came on brave, I'll give them that. Perfect lines, flags flying, looking like they'd march right over us. I picked an officer on a grey horse, must have been 300 yards out, set my sight picture careful, exhaled, squeezed the trigger, saw him fall backward over his horse's rump, reloaded maybe 45 seconds, picked a sergeant carrying a pike, He was yelling at his men, got him sent to mass at maybe 250 yards. By my fourth shot, they'd slowed down considerable. By my sixth, they were stopping, bunching up, looking lost. That's when the real killing started. You couldn't miss. They were standing in the open at 150 yards. Every man on our line was firing as fast as he could load. British soldiers were falling like wheat before a scythe. At 150 yards, the British advance disintegrated. Entire companies broke and ran. Officers trying to rally men were shot down instantly. The 93rd Highlanders, Scotland's finest, attempted to maintain formation. They paid terribly for their discipline. American riflemen poured fire into the compact ranks. Highlanders fell in groups, sometimes 3 or 4 men from a single devastating volley section. Some British soldiers did make it to the canal. These brave men, probably fewer than 100 total from an attacking force of thousands, found themselves trapped. The canal, barely 10 feet wide, had become an impassable barrier. Without fasteners to fill it or ladders to scale the opposite side, they huddled in the ditch while American riflemen shot down at them from point-blank range. It was slaughter. General Pakenham, seeing his assault collapsing, rode forward personally to rally his troops. It was the act of a brave man and a foolish general. Multiple riflemen spotted the mounted officer in his distinctive uniform. At least 3 men claimed credit for the shot that killed him, though the truth was lost in the chaos. What is certain is that Pakenham took a rifle ball through his thigh that severed his femoral artery. He bled out within minutes, dying on the field he had expected to cross in triumph. His second-in-command, General Samuel Gibbs, assumed control and tried to reorganize the assault. He was shot through the chest and mortally wounded within minutes. Major General John Keane, third-in-command, was severely wounded shortly after. The entire British command structure collapsed in less than 30 minutes. By 8:10 a.m., barely 2 hours after the assault began, the battle was effectively over. The British Army, the finest infantry in the world, had been shattered. They retreated in disorder, leaving the field covered with their dead and wounded. Behind the American rampart, riflemen emerged from behind the earthworks, stunned by what they had achieved. The field before them looked like descriptions of hell. Red-coated bodies lay in windrows, some in neat lines, showing where entire ranks had fallen almost simultaneously. The grass was red with blood. The cries of wounded British soldiers filled the air, over 2,000 men hit in less than 2 hours of combat. American casualties were absurdly light. Jackson's entire force, artillery included, had suffered approximately 13 killed, 39 wounded, and 19 missing. Many of the missing were later found to have deserted during the battle. The British had lost 291 killed, including their commanding general, and 2 other generals, over 600 wounded, and 484 captured. It was one of the most lopsided victories in military history. British officers who survived were in shock. These were men who had fought across Europe, who understood warfare as science and art. What had happened at New Orleans violated every principle they knew. Infantry could not be stopped by small arms fire. Disciplined soldiers advanced through musket volleys as a matter of course. Casualties were expected, even heavy casualties, but you pressed forward until you closed to bayonet range, then discipline and training would tell. But the Americans had killed them before they ever reached bayonet range. Captain John Cook, 43rd Regiment, wounded 3 times during the assault, was captured and brought behind American lines for treatment. Years later, he recorded his impressions in his memoirs. We had been told the Americans were militia, that they would run when they saw British regulars coming. No one had told us they could shoot like that. In Spain, the French would fire volleys, great clouds of smoke and thunder, terrifying but mostly harmless. We'd march through it, take our casualties, and close with the bayonet. At New Orleans, there were no volleys, just this constant irregular cracking of rifles, and every shot seemed to hit someone. I saw my colour sergeant, a man who'd served 20 years and survived a dozen battles, simply drop dead. No drama, no cry, just collapsed with a ball through his brain at what must have been 250 yards. That's not supposed to be possible. Muskets don't kill at that range. But these weren't muskets. The Americans had some sort of rifle that fired with uncanny accuracy, and the men using them weren't soldiers in any sense we understood. They were hunters, and they hunted us. The British Army had been defeated not by better tactics or superior numbers or fortunate circumstances, but by a fundamental technological and cultural advantage they hadn't understood existed. The long rifle in the hands of men trained from childhood to use it had made conventional infantry tactics obsolete. The psychological impact on British survivors was profound. These were soldiers who had defeated Napoleon's armies. They had maintained formation under artillery fire that literally tore men apart. They had charged French cavalry squares with bayonets. But accurate rifle fire aimed by skilled marksmen at impossible ranges had broken them. It was somehow more terrifying than massed volleys or artillery. You couldn't see who was shooting at you. There was no dramatic blast of musket fire to brace yourself against, just an irregular crack, 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 and men around you falling. The soldier next to you would grunt and fall with a ball through his chest, shot by a man 300 yards away behind earthworks, a man he'd never seen. How do you maintain courage when death can reach out and pluck you from impossible distance? British soldiers who had shown exemplary courage in Europe spoke of New Orleans with something approaching trauma. They had learned that all their training, all their discipline, all their experience meant nothing against an enemy that could kill them long before they could fight back. The Battle of New Orleans had strategic implications far beyond the casualty figures. Although it was fought 2 weeks after the Treaty of Ghent had been signed ending the War of 1812, news of the treaty had not reached either commander. Had the British won, they might have repudiated the treaty and demanded New Orleans as the price of peace. Jackson's victory ensured that wouldn't happen. But the tactical implications were even more significant. New Orleans demonstrated that the era of massed infantry formations was ending. Accurate long-range fire could defeat numerical superiority and professional training. The lesson wouldn't be fully absorbed for decades. European armies would continue using smoothbore muskets and close-order tactics through the Crimean War and into the American Civil War. But perceptive military thinkers recognized that something fundamental had changed. Captain Harry Smith, British staff officer who witnessed the battle, wrote in his journal an analysis that proved prophetic. Today, we saw the future of warfare and it terrified us. The Americans didn't defeat us through superior tactics or numbers. They simply shot us down from distances we couldn't respond to. Their rifles aren't standard military weapons. They take too long to load for normal infantry use. But behind fortifications, that doesn't matter. What matters is that they can kill at 300 yards with regularity. As firearms technology improves, as rifles become faster to load and more reliable, the day will come when all infantry carry weapons of such accuracy. When that day comes, the tactics we've used for a century will be suicide. Massed formations will be slaughtered. Brightly coloured uniforms will be death sentences. Infantry will have to disperse, take cover, fight as individuals rather than formations. The Americans showed us this future, and we paid in blood for the lesson. The riflemen who defended New Orleans came from a specific American frontier culture that had developed over a century. These weren't professional soldiers. Many were subsistence farmers who hunted to feed their families. Some were professional hunters who sold meat and hides. Others were frontier scouts and Indian fighters. What they had in common was that they'd spent thousands of hours shooting. Consider the economics that created such marksmen. Powder and lead were expensive on the frontier. A pound of powder cost about $1 in 1815, substantial money when farm labourers earned 50 cents per day. A bar of lead for casting balls cost another 25 cents. A careful shooter might get 40 shots from a pound of powder and 35 balls from a pound of lead. That meant every shot cost roughly 3 cents, a significant expense. Wasting ammunition meant your family might go hungry when winter came. This economic pressure created a culture of marksmanship as necessity. Boys learned to make the first shot count because there might not be a second chance. You didn't shoot at a deer and miss. You waited for a clear shot, aimed carefully, and killed cleanly. This mindset, repeated across thousands of frontier families, produced men who simply couldn't comprehend how European soldiers could fire muskets without aiming. The concept of volley fire, where soldiers pointed in the general direction of the enemy and fired on command, seemed wasteful and stupid to men who'd been taught that every shot must count. The rifles themselves reflected this culture. They were individually crafted, fitted to their owner. A tall man got a long rifle with a stock shaped for his build. A shorter man got a proportionally smaller weapon. The sights were adjusted for that specific shooter's eyesight. The trigger pull was set to the owner's preference. The weight and balance were personalised. These were custom tools, not mass-produced military weapons. A good rifle might cost $25 to $40, several months' wages for a working man. Men save for years to afford a quality rifle from a respected gunsmith. Once purchased, the rifle became a prized possession, maintained obsessively and often passed down through generations. The riflemen who fought at New Orleans brought these personal weapons, not military-issue firearms. In his official report after the battle, Andrew Jackson praised his men in terms that revealed the cultural divide between American and British approaches to warfare. The Tennessee and Kentucky riflemen proved themselves the finest marksmen in the world. Against the King's troops, veteran soldiers who have defeated Napoleon's best, our frontier militia inflicted casualties at rates that defy belief. Individual riflemen killed 5, 6, even 10 British soldiers in less than 2 hours of combat. They did so calmly, methodically, with a professionalism born not from military drill but from a lifetime of hunting. I observed men reloading with such practiced efficiency that their hands seemed to move by instinct. I saw riflemen making shots at 300 yards that I would have thought impossible. Most impressively, I saw no panic, no disorder, no breaking of ranks despite facing the most professional army on earth. These men knew their capabilities and trusted their weapons. That confidence proved more valuable than any amount of military training. Jackson understood something that European officers didn't. In the specific circumstances of New Orleans, defending prepared positions against attacking infantry, the frontier rifleman was superior to the professional soldier. The rifleman's entire life had prepared him for precisely this kind of fighting. Judge the distance, account for wind, aim carefully, kill with one shot. These men had been doing exactly that since childhood. The British Army's investigation into the defeat at New Orleans produced reports that were classified for years because their implications were so disturbing to military orthodoxy. Major General John Lambert, who assumed command after Pakenham's death and negotiated the British withdrawal, filed a detailed analysis in February 1815. The American success rested on 3 factors we failed to appreciate. First, their defensive position was far stronger than reconnaissance suggested. The earthwork, while crude, proved effectively immune to our artillery and provided excellent cover for their infantry. Second, their artillery was well served and accurately fired, contrary to our expectations of militia capabilities. Third, and most significantly, their infantry possessed weapons and skills we had no tactical answer for. The American rifle, while slower to load than our musket, is accurate to at least 300 yards in skilled hands. The Americans defending New Orleans possessed such skilled hands in abundance. Our soldiers were under effective aimed fire from the moment they came, within 350 yards of the American position. This fire continued with increasing intensity as they advanced. By the time our formations reached 150 yards, the range at which we would normally expect to receive first fire from enemy muskets, our assault had already taken catastrophic casualties. Officers and sergeants were deliberately targeted and killed at ranges our troops could not respond to. This systematically destroyed unit cohesion and command structure. I must note that American marksmanship exceeded anything in my 30 years of military experience. Soldiers were struck with headshots at over 200 yards. Officers on horseback were killed at 300 yards. This was not lucky fire or occasional accurate shooting. This was consistent professional marksmanship applied by hundreds of enemy combatants. Our troops, veterans of European campaigns, had never faced such accurate fire. The psychological impact was severe. Soldiers who had advanced steadily under French musket volleys found themselves unable to continue advancing when individual riflemen were killing them from distances they considered safe. The defeat at New Orleans was not due to cowardice or poor leadership. It resulted from our ignorance of American rifle capabilities and the skills of frontiersmen who use these weapons. Lambert's analysis was largely ignored by British military leadership. The lesson that rifle fire could defeat professional infantry was too radical, too threatening to established doctrine. The British Army would continue using smoothbore muskets as standard infantry weapons for another 40 years. But American military thinkers took note. The success of riflemen at New Orleans, combined with similar demonstrations during the Revolution, influenced American military doctrine. While the US Army continued to equip most infantry with smoothbore muskets for economic reasons and rate of fire in open battle, rifle companies became standard in every regiment. The cultural impact in America was profound. The Battle of New Orleans became legendary, celebrated in songs and stories. The image of rugged frontiersmen defeating professional British soldiers reinforced American notions of democratic virtue overcoming aristocratic pretension. It wasn't entirely accurate. Jackson's force included regulars, artillery, and diverse militia, not just riflemen. The defensive position and British tactical errors contributed significantly to the outcome, but the mythology centered on the rifleman, and particularly on the image of individual American marksmen, outfighting professional soldiers through superior shooting skill. This mythology served a purpose. It reinforced the American ideal that citizen soldiers could defend the nation without maintaining large professional armies. It suggested that American individualism and practical skills were superior to European rigid discipline. Most importantly for our story, it established marksmanship as a specifically American military virtue. The Riflemen of New Orleans represented the culmination of a frontier culture that was already beginning to fade by 1815. As the frontier moved westward and settlement increased, the subsistence hunting economy that produced such marksmen became less common. But the legend of New Orleans ensured that marksmanship remained part of American military identity. The actual mechanics of the shooting at New Orleans deserve examination because they explain why the results were so lopsided. American riflemen weren't superhuman. They were simply using superior technology and superior skills in circumstances that maximized both advantages. The earthwork Jackson constructed provided a stable shooting platform. Riflemen could rest their weapons on the top of the rampart, eliminating the difficulties of shooting from standing or kneeling positions. This dramatically improved accuracy. The rampart was roughly chest high, allowing shooters to sight comfortably while their bodies remained protected. The British advancing across open ground presented perfect targets. They were moving slowly in dense formation, wearing bright red coats that contrasted sharply with the green fields. At 300 yards, a man-sized target subtends roughly 6 arc minutes of angle. A good rifle from a steady rest could shoot 2 to 3 arc minutes of accuracy. This meant hitting a specific man at 300 yards was reasonably probable for a skilled shooter. The environmental conditions that morning were nearly ideal for shooting. Temperature in the 40s meant powder burned consistently. The morning was calm with minimal wind. The fog that initially obscured vision at ground level actually helped American shooters because British soldiers visible above the fog were perfectly silhouetted. As the fog burned off, visibility improved to perfect clarity. The British made several tactical errors that compounded their problems. They advanced in tight formation, standard practice for musket-armed infantry. This maximized the effectiveness of accurate rifle fire, since even a shot that missed the intended target might hit someone else in the dense ranks. They advanced slowly, at quick march rather than running. Again standard practice, but giving American riflemen more time to aim carefully. They continued to advance in formation even after taking heavy casualties, maintaining their parade ground discipline even as it killed them. Most critically, British commanders failed to adjust tactics even when the assault was clearly failing. A competent general, recognizing that frontal assault was suicidal, would have withdrawn and attempted different tactics. Flanking maneuvers, night attacks, siege tactics, anything but continued frontal assault against prepared positions manned by accurate shooters. But British doctrine emphasized maintaining the assault. Withdrawal was seen as shameful. Officers were trained that determined infantry could carry any position with the bayonet. This doctrine had worked against French armies. It failed catastrophically against American riflemen. The aftermath of New Orleans saw British and American forces maintain an informal truce while negotiating withdrawal. During this period, British officers visited the American lines under flags of truce to arrange prisoner exchanges and care for wounded. Many took the opportunity to examine American rifles and question the defenders about their shooting. Captain John Henry Cook, recovering from his wounds, was allowed to test fire a Kentucky rifle owned by a Tennessee militiaman. His account reveals British incomprehension of American shooting culture. The owner, a farmer named William Carson, offered to let me fire his rifle at a mark. He set up a playing card at 100 yards, edge facing us, and said to hit it. I thought he was joking. With a musket, I'd be fortunate to hit a man-sized target at that distance. He fired first, cutting the card cleanly. Then he handed me the rifle. The weapon felt strange, lighter than a musket but longer and more delicate. The balance was different, weight forward in the barrel. He showed me how to load it, carefully measuring powder from a horn, seating a patched ball with a wooden ramrod that required substantial force to drive the ball down the rifled bore. The loading process took nearly a minute, far longer than loading my musket. When I fired, I missed the card entirely, though I hit the board behind it. Carson laughed, not unkindly, and said I'd done well for a first shot with a rifle. He explained that he'd been shooting that particular weapon for 12 years. He knew exactly how it behaved, how much it dropped at any distance, how wind affected the ball, how temperature changed the point of impact. He'd fired thousands of rounds through it. He said that on a good day, he could hit a man's head at 200 yards more often than not. At New Orleans, he told me, he'd killed 7 British soldiers in the first hour of battle. He said it calmly, as though reporting the results of a day's hunting, which, in a sense, I suppose it was. That casual competence, that absolute confidence in his weapon and his skill, was more unsettling than facing enemy artillery. We had been defeated not by better soldiers, but by better shooters. The distinction mattered. The social composition of Jackson's riflemen also contributed to their effectiveness in ways that troubled British observers. European armies of the era drew their rank and file from the lowest classes. British soldiers were often recruited from prisons or press-ganged into service. They were led by officers from aristocratic families who purchased their commissions. The class divide was fundamental to military organisation. Officers were gentlemen who led. Enlisted men were common labourers who followed. This system produced discipline and obedience, but not initiative or individual skill. American riflemen came from a different social structure. Most were small landowners or their sons. They elected their own officers, at least at the company level. They maintained a rough equality where competence mattered more than birth. A company might be led by a wealthy planter's son, but the best shot in the company might be a dirt farmer's boy, and everyone knew who he was. This democratic structure produced soldiers who thought for themselves, who understood why they were fighting, and who took personal pride in their martial skills. At New Orleans, riflemen weren't following orders blindly. They were applying skills they'd developed independently, competing with each other informally to see who could shoot most accurately. British officer John Cook noted this in his memoir with a mixture of admiration and discomfort. Their soldiers showed none of the discipline we expect. They slouched. They joked with their officers. They seemed to follow orders only when they felt like it. Yet in combat, they were devastatingly effective. Each man fought as an individual, selecting his own targets, firing when ready rather than on command. There was no volley fire, no coordinated shooting, just hundreds of individual marksmen, each acting independently, each supremely confident in his abilities. It was chaos by our standards, yet it worked because every single man was a genuine shooter. In our army, we trained men to stand in formation and follow orders. In their army, every man was already skilled before he arrived. They didn't need to be trained to shoot, they only needed to be pointed at the enemy. This represented a fundamental difference in military philosophy. The British system assumed that individual soldiers were interchangeable parts in a machine. Training imposed uniformity. Officers provided intelligence and decision-making. Enlisted men provided muscle and obedience. The American rifle companies inverted this relationship. Individual soldiers possessed specialized skills that officers couldn't match. The best shooter in a company might be a private. Officers coordinated and directed but didn't provide technical expertise. This worked because frontier culture had already produced skilled marksmen. The military simply had to organize them. The limitations of the American approach became evident in battles fought under different circumstances. At the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in 1814, Jackson's riflemen had struggled in close terrain against Creek warriors, who were equally skilled at wilderness combat. In open field battles against British regulars earlier in the war, American militia had often performed poorly, breaking under artillery fire or bayonet charges. The rifle's slow rate of fire made it unsuitable for offensive operations where rapid movement was required. Its inability to mount a bayonet left riflemen vulnerable to cavalry or determined infantry charges. These limitations meant that rifles couldn't replace muskets as standard infantry weapons. But at New Orleans, fighting defensively from prepared positions, every limitation was negated and every advantage maximized. The result was the most lopsided tactical victory in the War of 1812. The long-term military implications of New Orleans took decades to fully manifest. The Mexican-American War saw American riflemen again demonstrate their effectiveness, particularly in the hands of mounted Texas Rangers whose shooting skills terrified Mexican soldiers. The Crimean War showed European powers that massed infantry tactics were becoming obsolete as rifle technology improved. The minié-ball, invented in 1847, solved the rifle's loading speed problem by using a conical bullet that expanded upon firing to engage the rifling. This allowed rifles to be loaded as quickly as muskets while maintaining accuracy. By the American Civil War, both sides fielded infantry armed primarily with rifled muskets. The result was carnage on an unprecedented scale as generals trained in Napoleonic tactics sent men in massed formations against accurate rifle fire. The lessons of New Orleans, ignored for 50 years, were relearned in blood at Fredericksburg, Cold Harbor, and 100 other battles where attacking infantry was slaughtered by defenders firing accurate rifles. Modern military tactics, emphasizing cover, dispersion, and suppressive fire, trace their origins to the obsolescence of close-order formations. That obsolescence was dramatically demonstrated at New Orleans, though few European military leaders acknowledged it at the time. The individual stories of riflemen at New Orleans reveal the human dimension of the battle. These weren't anonymous soldiers, but men with names, histories, and specific skills they'd developed over lifetimes. Private Samuel Wells of the Kentucky Militia was 19 years old at New Orleans, the youngest of 7 brothers, all of whom hunted to supplement their family's farm income in the hills of eastern Kentucky. Wells had received his first rifle at age 11, a .45 caliber Lancaster pattern made by a local gunsmith. By 14, he was providing most of the meat for his family, deer primarily, but also turkey, bear when opportunity arose, and small game. He'd never fired his rifle at a human target before January 8, 1815. In a letter written 40 years later to his grandson, Wells described his experience at New Orleans with the matter-of-fact tone of a man reporting routine work. We were positioned on the right of the line near the swamp. The ground before us was open cane fields, maybe 600 yards to where the British formed up. When they started forward, they looked like a red carpet being unrolled toward us. There must have been thousands of them. I'll admit my hands shook a bit as I loaded my rifle. Not from fear exactly, but from the strangeness of it. I'd shot deer and bear, but never aimed at a man. Captain Miller walked behind us and said, "Calm down, boys. They're just targets. Aim careful like you're shooting for prize money." That helped. I could understand shooting for a prize. When they got to maybe 300 yards, I picked out an officer on a horse, set my sights, took up the slack in my trigger, exhaled and squeezed. The rifle pushed back into my shoulder like it always did. Through the smoke, I saw the officer fall. Reloaded, hands steadier now. The fear had gone. This was just shooting, and I'd been shooting since I was a boy. I fired 11 times that morning before they retreated. I'm certain of 6 hits saw the men fall. The others I can't be sure. Maybe hit, maybe missed in all the confusion. At one point, a British soldier made it nearly to the canal, maybe 50 yards away. He was waving a sword, yelling at his men to follow. I shot him through the chest. He looked surprised, like he couldn't believe what had happened. That's the only one that bothered me, being close enough to see his face. The others were just distant figures, not much different than deer in a clearing. Afterward, we walked over the field to help the wounded. I'd never seen so many dead men. The smell was terrible. Blood and powder smoke and men crying for water or their mothers. I found the soldier I'd shot at close range. He was young, maybe my age, with red hair. He had a letter in his pocket addressed to someone named Margaret. I've wondered about her sometimes over the years. Did she ever learn what happened to him? Did she know he died in Louisiana, shot by a Kentucky farm boy who'd never left the county before volunteering? I don't feel guilt exactly. He was trying to kill me and my friends. But I think about it sometimes. How strange it is that I killed men I had no quarrel with, men whose names I never knew, just because governments decided we should fight. Wells' account captures the psychological reality of the battle from the rifleman's perspective. For many, it truly was like hunting, a practical application of familiar skills against unfamiliar targets. The psychological distance provided by the rifle's range made killing easier. At 300 yards, targets weren't individual humans with faces and families. They were silhouettes, marks to aim at, problems to solve through careful shooting technique. This psychological distancing wouldn't be formally studied until the 20th century, but it was intuitively understood by experienced hunters. Shooting game at distance was easier than butchering it afterward, when the reality of death became tangible. Similarly, shooting British soldiers at 300 yards was psychologically simpler than bayoneting them at arm's reach. The rifle's effectiveness at New Orleans also depended on logistics that are often overlooked. Each rifleman fired between 10 and 20 shots during the main assault. With roughly 2,000 riflemen engaged, that meant approximately 30,000 rounds fired in less than 2 hours. Each round required powder, ball, and patch. The powder alone represented nearly 1,000 pounds consumed in the battle, valued at roughly $1,000 in 1815 currency. The balls required approximately 600 pounds of lead. The patches required several hundred yards of cotton or linen cloth. All of this material had to be transported to New Orleans, stored properly to keep powder dry, and distributed to riflemen before the battle. Jackson's logistics officers, often overlooked in histories of the battle, performed admirably. Powder magazines were established behind the American lines. Lead for casting balls was requisitioned from New Orleans merchants, including lead stripped from window weights and piping. Women in the city cut cloth into patches of appropriate size. This supply system kept American riflemen stocked with ammunition throughout the battle. The British, by contrast, struggled with logistics throughout the campaign. Transporting heavy artillery across swamps and establishing supply lines proved difficult. The coordination failure that left the 44th Regiment without fascines and ladders on the morning of January 8th reflected broader logistical problems. But ammunition supply wasn't an issue for British musket-armed infantry. Each soldier carried 60 rounds, and few fired more than a dozen before the assault collapsed. The battle's brevity meant British logistics didn't matter. They were defeated before supplies became a factor. The medical aftermath of the battle revealed another dimension of rifle effectiveness. British surgeons treating wounded soldiers noted that rifle wounds were often more severe than musket wounds. Despite both weapons firing roughly similar projectiles, the explanation lay in velocity and accuracy. Rifle balls, fired from longer barrels with more complete powder combustion, travelled faster than musket balls. Higher velocity meant deeper penetration and more tissue damage. Additionally, riflemen aimed for vital areas, chest and head, while musket fire distributed randomly across the body. British casualties included a disproportionate number of immediately fatal wounds. Headshots were common at New Orleans, uncommon in European battles where musket fire was random. Chest shots through heart or lungs killed within minutes. The accuracy of American fire meant fewer wounded soldiers who might recover, and more immediately fatal wounds. Dr. Robert Morrell, chief surgeon of the British force, noted this in his medical report. The nature of wounds sustained differs markedly from typical battle casualties. Approximately 60% of wounds treated were to the head or torso, compared to perhaps 30% in typical musket engagements, where most casualties result from random fire-striking extremities. The precision of enemy fire resulted in far higher immediate mortality. Many soldiers were dead before reaching aid stations. Those who survived initial wounding often had severe injuries incompatible with survival given available medical treatment. The enemy's marksmanship effectively tripled the lethality of their fire compared to equivalent musket volleys. From a medical perspective, this battle resembled nothing in my 20 years of military surgical experience. The correlation between high accuracy and high lethality seems obvious in retrospect, but wasn't appreciated by military planners. Subsequent studies of Civil War casualties would show the same pattern. As infantry weapons became more accurate, the proportion of immediately fatal wounds increased dramatically. The assumption that improved accuracy would simply produce more casualties missed the more significant point that it produced more deaths. At New Orleans, this meant British casualties, who might have survived wounds inflicted by musket volleys, instead died from precisely aimed rifle fire. The battle also demonstrated the importance of terrain in determining tactical outcomes. Jackson's position was nearly ideal for defensive rifle fire. The British had to advance across open ground with no cover. The gentle slope meant American riflemen could see targets clearly at all ranges. The restricted frontage between river and swamp prevented the British from using their numerical superiority effectively. Had the battle been fought on different terrain, results might have differed dramatically. In forests or broken ground, rifles lost their range advantage. British regulars trained in European warfare might have prevailed through superior organisation and bayonet work. In open field battle where manoeuvre was possible, British artillery and cavalry could have been decisive. The specific circumstances of New Orleans, a defensive position with clear fields of fire and restricted frontage, maximised rifle effectiveness and minimised British advantages. This geographic luck combined with tactical skill and technological advantage to produce the lopsided outcome. General Jackson understood this perfectly. His defensive position was chosen specifically to favour his riflemen. When subordinates suggested alternative positions that offered other advantages, Jackson insisted on the Rodriguez Canal line because it provided the open fields his riflemen needed. The victory at New Orleans was therefore not simply the triumph of rifle over musket, but the intelligent application of rifle capabilities to favourable terrain. Jackson positioned his strengths against British weaknesses in circumstances that maximised American advantages. The psychological impact on British survivors lasted well beyond the battle itself. Soldiers who had served with distinction in European campaigns found themselves suffering what would later be recognised as post-traumatic stress. The specific trauma seemed to come not from the horror of casualties, which they'd experienced before, but from the helplessness of being shot at with no ability to return fire effectively. Lieutenant George Gleig of the 85th Regiment wrote extensively about his experiences at New Orleans in his 1847 memoir. His description of the assault reveals psychological dimensions rarely discussed in military histories. The advance began in good order, with men confident of victory. We had defeated French regulars at Orthez and Toulouse. These, American militia, seemed unlikely to stand before British bayonets. But as we advanced, men began falling with disturbing regularity. Not from massed volleys, but from individual shots. A sergeant would fall, then a corporal, then a private. There was no rhythm to it, no pattern, just a constant irregular crackling and men dying. At 200 yards I realised we were being hunted. That's the only word that captures the feeling. We weren't soldiers engaged in honourable combat. We were game animals being shot by unseen hunters. You couldn't see who was shooting. You couldn't return fire effectively. Our muskets couldn't reach them. You simply walked forward and waited to be shot, hoping the ball would miss you and strike the man beside you instead. The terror was unlike anything I'd experienced. Artillery is frightening, but it's impersonal. Cavalry charges are terrifying, but you can fight back. This was being executed by marksmen you couldn't even see. Men around me began to panic, not running, but losing cohesion, bunching together for psychological comfort, which only made us better targets. Officers screamed orders to maintain formation, but many officers were being deliberately targeted and killed. I saw 3 company commanders shot in succession, each lasting only seconds after assuming command. When the order to retreat finally came, it was shameful how quickly we broke and ran, not from enemy bayonets or cavalry pursuit, but from rifle fire. We ran from men who were still 100 yards away behind earthworks. That haunted me for years afterward. I had faced French Imperial Guard without flinching, but I ran from American militia because I couldn't endure being shot at without ability to respond. Gleig's honesty reveals a truth about warfare rarely acknowledged in the heroic narratives of the era. The psychological dimension of combat often mattered more than the physical. British soldiers could endure heavy casualties from musket volleys because they could return fire, because they understood the familiar rhythm of European warfare, because they could close with bayonets and fight man to man. Rifle fire from prepared positions offered none of these psychological comforts. It was simply execution at distance, and even veteran soldiers couldn't endure it indefinitely. The battle's impact on American military thought was significant but took unexpected forms. Rather than leading to universal adoption of rifles for all infantry, New Orleans reinforced the idea that specialised rifle units had their place but couldn't replace standard musket-armed infantry. The War Department established permanent rifle regiments after the war, but most infantry continued carrying smoothbore muskets through the 1840s. The practical reasons were sound. Rifles were expensive, costing 3 times as much as muskets. They required more maintenance and skilled gunsmiths to repair. They were slower to load, reducing rate of fire in open battle. Most importantly, not every soldier could become a skilled rifleman. The frontier culture that produced marksmen couldn't be replicated through military training. You couldn't take a city-dwelling immigrant and turn him into a Kentucky rifleman through a few months of drill. The skill required years to develop, starting in childhood. The American military solution was to maintain both types of infantry. Rifle companies of specially selected men, often frontiersmen, provided accurate long-range fire. Regular infantry with muskets provided volley fire and bayonet capability. This mixed approach proved effective in the Mexican-American War and continued through the 1850s, when improved rifle technology finally made accurate rifles practical for all infantry. The Civil War demonstrated the horrific effectiveness of accurate defensive fire. Battles like Fredericksburg and Cold Harbor were essentially New Orleans repeated dozens of times. Attacking infantry advancing against defenders with accurate rifles suffered catastrophic casualties. The tactics that had worked in the Napoleonic era became obsolete, though many generals continued using them with predictable results. The mythology surrounding New Orleans grew elaborate over subsequent decades. Popular songs like The Hunters of Kentucky celebrated the rifleman's prowess with lyrics that bordered on comic exaggeration. "We are a hardy, freeborn race, each man to fear a stranger, whate'er the game we join in chase, despising toil and danger. And if a daring foe annoys, whate'er his strength and forces, we'll show him that Kentucky boys are alligator horses." The song, performed in theatres across America, established the rifleman as a national archetype. The image of the frontier marksman, independent, skilled, and deadly, became central to American self-conception. This mythology simplified complex reality. New Orleans was won by a combination of factors, not just rifle fire. American artillery, led by Barratarian pirates, performed excellently. Regular army units provided backbone and discipline. Free men of colour fought courageously. The defensive position was crucial. British tactical errors compounded their problems. But the myth focused on riflemen because they represented uniquely American virtues. European soldiers were products of rigid social hierarchy and military discipline. American riflemen were independent citizens defending their homes with skills developed through individual merit. The mythology was politically useful, supporting arguments for minimal standing armies and reliance on citizen militia. If frontier riflemen could defeat professional British soldiers, why maintain expensive regular forces? This argument influenced American military policy through the 19th century, with mixed results. Militia performed well when defending prepared positions, as at New Orleans. They performed poorly in offensive operations or sustained campaigns, requiring logistical support and discipline. The myth also obscured the changing nature of American society. By the 1840s, the frontier culture that had produced the riflemen of New Orleans was fading. Industrialization, immigration, and urbanization were creating a different America. The subsistence hunter providing meat for his family was becoming rare. Most Americans had never fired a rifle, much less developed the skills displayed at New Orleans. Yet the myth persisted because it served cultural and political purposes. Americans wanted to believe that citizen soldiers with practical skills could defend the nation. The riflemen of New Orleans proved this was possible, at least in specific circumstances. That the circumstances were exceptional and might not be replicated mattered less than the inspiring example. In Britain, the defeat at New Orleans was quietly forgotten, overshadowed by the dramatic victory at Waterloo 6 months later. British military histories gave minimal attention to the American battle, treating it as an unfortunate incident in a minor theatre. The lessons about rifle effectiveness were largely ignored. The social implications were too troubling. If common American farmers could defeat British regulars through superior shooting skills, what did that say about the British class system that drew officers from aristocracy and enlisted men from the dregs of society? Better to forget New Orleans and focus on Wellington's triumph over Napoleon, a victory that confirmed the superiority of British military organisation. Yet some perceptive British observers understood they'd witnessed something significant. The Duke of Wellington himself, reading reports of the battle, reportedly said, "I never would have done it. A defensive position of that strength, manned by men who can shoot like that, cannot be carried by frontal assault." Pakenham should have recognised this and withdrawn. Whether Wellington actually said this is disputed, but the sentiment reflected growing understanding among military professionals that tactics were changing. The final verification of American rifle superiority came from an unexpected source. In 1816, the British Army conducted tests comparing captured American rifles to British muskets. Firing at targets from various ranges, they documented what American frontiersmen had known for decades. At 100 yards, muskets hit man-sized targets approximately 40% of the time. Rifles hit 90%. At 200 yards, muskets hit approximately 15% of the time. Rifles hit 70%. At 300 yards, muskets rarely hit targets at all. Rifles hit approximately 50% of the time. These tests, conducted with average British soldiers after minimal training with captured rifles, demonstrated the weapon's inherent superiority. With skilled riflemen firing from steady rests, accuracy would be even higher. The test confirmed what the British Army had learned through blood at New Orleans. In any engagement where range and accuracy mattered, rifles dominated muskets. The institutional response was to begin developing British rifles that could match American performance. This process took decades, but eventually produced the Baker rifle and later the Enfield rifle, weapons that brought European infantry into the rifle age. By the Crimean War, most European powers were transitioning to rifled firearms. The age of smoothbore muskets and massed volley fire was ending. The era of accurate rifles, dispersed infantry, and individual marksmanship was beginning. New Orleans was thus both an ending and a beginning. It was the last major battle where smoothbore muskets faced rifles, in circumstances that starkly revealed the musket's obsolescence. It was the first major battle to demonstrate conclusively that accurate defensive fire could annihilate attacking infantry before they could close to bayonet range. The tactical lessons would reshape warfare over the following decades. For the riflemen who fought there, the battle was simply a day's work, an application of skills they'd developed hunting deer in Kentucky forests or squirrels in Tennessee hills. They had aimed carefully, fired when ready, and hit what they aimed at. That British generals hadn't expected this, that European military doctrine had no answer for it, that thousands of British soldiers died as a result. These weren't their concern. They'd done what they were asked to do. They'd defended New Orleans with the skills they possessed. The city was saved. That was enough. In the end, the Battle of New Orleans revealed a fundamental truth about military affairs that remains relevant today. Technological and tactical superiority can overcome numerical and professional advantages. The side with better tools and better trained people to use those tools will prevail, even when outnumbered and facing more experienced opponents. The American riflemen possess both superior weapons and superior skills for using them. In the specific circumstances of New Orleans, defending prepared positions against attacking infantry, these advantages proved decisive. The British had better organisation, better discipline, more combat experience, and superior professional military leadership. None of it mattered when their soldiers couldn't reach their enemy without being shot down. The American victory at New Orleans was therefore not an accident or a fluke. It was the inevitable result of matching strengths against weaknesses in circumstances that favoured those strengths. Jackson understood this and positioned his forces accordingly. British commanders understood European warfare and applied European tactics that failed catastrophically against an enemy fighting differently. On January 8, 1815, on a muddy field outside New Orleans, American riflemen demonstrated that a man who could consistently hit targets at 300 yards was worth more than 10 men firing random musket volleys. The mathematics were brutal and simple. Accurate fire defeated inaccurate fire. Individual marksmanship trumped volley. Discipline, technology and skill combined to overcome numbers and professionalism. British generals had expected to sweep aside American militia and capture New Orleans within days. Instead, they encountered men who'd learned to shoot before they could write, firing rifles more accurate than anything in British arsenals, defending positions chosen specifically to maximise those advantages. The result was one of the most lopsided battles in military history. The thunder of British artillery had announced their attack. The crack of American rifles had answered, and when the smoke cleared, the field was covered with British dead, while American casualties barely exceeded a dozen. The age of the rifleman had arrived and the British Army had learned its lessons in blood.